The midday sun hung heavy over Briarwood County, Alabama, turning the dusty back road into a shimmering strip of heat. Elijah Carter, 37 years old, wiped the sweat from his brow as he stepped out of his Chevrolet Silverado. A blown tire had forced him to pull over, and now he stood, hands on his hips, surveying the damage. It was supposed to be a simple day. He had just left a charity event in Montgomery, where he spoke about economic opportunities for marginalized communities. He had built his success from the ground up, a black entrepreneur who had defied every odd. But none of that mattered now. As Elijah reached into the truck bed for the jack, the sudden wail of a siren cut through the thick air. A black and white police cruiser screeched to a halt just feet away, kicking up a storm of red dust. Before he could react, a uniformed officer jumped out, gun drawn. Hands in the air. Now, Elijah froze. Officer Brock Henderson, 42 years old, his lean frame stiff with tension, stood with his pistol locked on Elijah's chest. His sunburned face twisted into a sneer. "Step away from the vehicle, thief. Get down on your knees." Elijah's pulse pounded in his ears. "Officer, this is my truck," he said carefully, his voice even, controlled. Brock scoffed, his grip tightening on the gun. "I know stolen property when I see it. Someone like you doesn't drive something this nice unless it's hot." Elijah clenched his jaw. "Someone like you." He had heard those words before. Raising his hands slowly, he fought the anger crawling up his spine. He had spoken before Congress, shaken hands with governors, built a business empire. But right here, right now, none of it protected him. Because before his name, before his accomplishments, the only thing Brock saw was the color of his skin. He swallowed hard, forcing his breath to stay steady. "Let me show you my registration, officer," he said, keeping his tone calm. Brock's lip curled. "Don't move a damn inch." And just like that, Elijah Carter's ordinary afternoon turned into a nightmare, one that would shake the very foundation of his life. Elijah Carter stood still, his hands raised high, sweat trickling down his neck. The sun was brutal, but the real heat came from Officer Brock Henderson's glare, his gun unwavering. "I need you to listen, officer," Elijah said carefully, his voice steady despite the tension winding through his muscles. "This is my truck. The registration is in the glove compartment. You can check it yourself." But Brock didn't budge. Instead, he took a slow step forward, eyes narrowing. "I don't need to check a damn thing," he spat. "I've been on the force for 20 years. I know when someone's lying." Elijah inhaled sharply. This wasn't about the truck. This was about control. "Sir, Shut up," Brock snapped, jabbing the gun toward him. "Turn around, hands on the truck." Now, for a split second, Elijah considered resisting. Not physically, but in words, in principle. He had spent his life proving people like Brock wrong. But as he glanced around, no witnesses, no cameras, just a lonely back road in the deep south. He knew this wasn't the time to fight. So he complied. Slowly, deliberately, he turned and placed his palms against the hot metal of his truck. The next second, Brock slammed into him from behind, forcing his chest against the door. "I said, don't move," the officer barked, pressing his knee hard into Elijah's lower back. Pain shot up his spine. His jaw clenched, his fingers curled into fists against the metal, but he refused to give Brock the reaction he wanted. The cuffs snapped around his wrists, too tight, biting into his skin. "You're under arrest," Brock growled, yanking him backward. Elijah's breath hitched. "For what?" The officer grinned. "Grand theft auto, resisting arrest, obstruction." "Lies." Elijah twisted his head, meeting Brock's gaze, his own dark eyes blazing. "You know this is a mistake." Brock chuckled, shoving him toward the police cruiser. "Mistake?" "Nah," he said, smirking. "The mistake was thinking you could get away with it." The word "you" dripped with meaning. Elijah gritted his teeth as Brock shoved him into the back seat. The moment the door slammed shut, he knew this wasn't just a bad encounter. This was an execution of power, a performance of control. The cruiser's radio crackled to life. "Henderson, what's your status?" Brock grabbed the receiver, keeping his eyes on Elijah through the mirror. "Got a suspect in custody," he said, his voice smug. "Caught him red-handed." Elijah exhaled slowly, his heartbeat steady despite the storm inside him. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The squad car jolted over potholes as it sped down the back roads of Briarwood County, dust swirling in its wake. Elijah Carter sat in the back seat, wrists burning from the too tight cuffs, his mind racing. His Chevrolet Silverado, his own damn truck, was still sitting abandoned on the roadside. Brock Henderson kept glancing at him through the rearview mirror, his smirk barely concealed. "You don't look so confident now, do you?" the officer taunted. "But you thought you could talk your way out of this." Elijah stared back, his expression unreadable. He had spoken in boardrooms, negotiated million-dollar contracts, sat across from political figures, but nothing in his life had prepared him for this. Because logic didn't matter here. Truth didn't matter here. The only thing that mattered was what Brock Henderson wanted to believe. The police station loomed ahead, a squat brick building, its windows lined with rusted bars. As soon as the car screeched to a stop, 2 more officers stepped out to greet them. Deputy Mason, mid-40s, stocky, with a permanent scowl. Officer Riley, late 30s, bald. Chewing gum like this was just another routine stop. Brock opened the car door and yanked Elijah out, gripping his arm tighter than necessary. "What do we got?" Mason asked, eyeing Elijah up and down. "Caught this one trying to run off in a stolen truck," Brock replied, his tone casual, like he was discussing a stray dog. Elijah stiffened. "That's a lie." Riley snorted, stepping closer. "Yeah? You saying an officer of the law is lying?" "I'm saying the truth is in the glove box," Elijah shot back. "My name is Elijah Carter. I own that vehicle. Check the damn registration." Mason shook his head. "You see? That's the problem these days," he muttered. "They think they can talk their way out of anything." Brock grinned, grabbing Elijah's wallet from his pocket and flipping it open. The state-issued ID, the business cards, the bank cards, all proof of who he was. And then, without hesitation, Brock dropped it to the ground and stomped on it, grinding it into the dirt. Elijah's stomach twisted. Not from fear, from rage. Riley let out a low whistle. "Fake as hell." Mason chuckled, already pulling out his clipboard. "Let's get him booked. Call the judge. We'll make sure this one learns his lesson." The judge. Elijah felt his chest tighten, because he knew exactly who they were talking about. Judge Richard Calloway, a man notorious for harsh sentences, for throwing the book at black men without blinking. This wasn't just an arrest. This was a machine built to break him, and it had just started its work. The station smelled of sweat, stale coffee, and something sour, like old desperation soaked into the walls. Elijah Carter was marched inside, his wrists still bound, his suit now wrinkled and streaked with dust. Behind him, Brock Henderson, Deputy Mason, and Officer Riley laughed among themselves as if this were all some private joke. Elijah kept his back straight, his chin high. He wouldn't let them see him break. At the booking desk, Sergeant Clay Reeves, a grizzled officer with a gut spilling over his belt, barely looked up as Brock shoved Elijah forward. "Name?" Reeves droned, flipping through a tattered ledger. "Elijah Carter," he said, voice even. Reeves paused mid-scribble, raising a bushy brow. "Carter?" "The businessman." Elijah exhaled. "Finally, someone who might recognize him." "That's right," he said. "And if you check my—" Brock slapped a heavy hand on Elijah's shoulder, cutting him off. "Don't bother, Clay. He's a fraud. Tried to steal a truck. Got a little mouthy, too." Reeves shrugged, disinterest returning to his face. "Figures." He scribbled something, then waved to 2 waiting officers. "Print him." Elijah's hands were yanked forward. They pressed his fingers into an ink pad, rolling them onto a sheet with exaggerated force, as if trying to break bone. One of the officers, a younger man with pale freckles, smirked. "Oops, smudged it," he said. Another officer chuckled. "Guess we gotta do it again." They did it twice more, each time pressing harder, each time making it worse. A deliberate move, messed up prints could be used against him later. Then came the mugshot. The flash blinded him for a second, but what burned more was the knowledge of where this photo would go. A database full of criminals, a record meant to stain him forever. When it was done, they dragged him to a side room. Inside sat Judge Richard Calloway. Even in the dim light, Calloway's presence was suffocating. His gray hair was slicked back, his lined face unreadable. He barely looked up from the stack of files in front of him. "Henderson," he said, "what do we have here?" Brock crossed his arms, smug. "Caught him trying to jack a truck. Resisted. Might be involved in something bigger." Elijah gritted his teeth. "Your Honor, that is a lie. My vehicle registration is." Calloway slammed a hand on the table. "Enough." He finally lifted his gaze, his blue eyes cold as stone. I don't care what you claim you are. You don't speak unless spoken to. A chill crawled up Elijah's spine. You're denying me a lawyer? Calloway smirked. We'll get to that. But right now, we're focusing on why you thought you could get away with this. Elijah felt the walls closing in. This wasn't a hearing. It was a sentencing. And then, just when he thought it couldn't get worse, Brock stepped forward, waving something in the air. Elijah's wallet. And in his other hand, a small plastic bag filled with white powder. Found this on him too, Brock said, tossing it onto the judge's desk. Elijah's blood turned to ice. That's not mine, he said, voice sharp. Calloway just sighed, shaking his head. Drugs too? Lord, you boys make it too easy. Elijah felt his stomach drop. They were framing him for something even worse. Because stealing a truck was one thing. But drugs? That could bury him alive. The cell door slammed shut, metal on metal, a sound that reverberated through the small, dimly lit room. Elijah Carter sat on the hard cot, his wrists raw from the cuffs, his mind racing. The charges against him were piling up like bricks meant to build his prison. Grand theft auto, resisting arrest, now drug possession, planted evidence by Brock Henderson, served on a silver platter to Judge Calloway. His breath was steady, but his hands curled into fists. He had built his life from nothing, carved his own path, fought for a seat at the table, only to be thrown into a cage like an animal. And they expected him to accept it. A soft shuffle echoed from outside the bars. Elijah looked up sharply as a figure approached, a young officer, early 20s, slim, dark skin, nervous hands gripping a clipboard. Nathan Foster. Elijah had seen him around before, one of the new recruits, fresh-faced, still untouched by the rod in this system. Nathan hesitated at the bars, eyes darting left and right. Sir, he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. I know who you are. Elijah sat up straighter. Then you know this is a setup. Nathan swallowed hard, glancing over his shoulder. I checked. Your truck's registration is clean. No reports of theft. The drugs weren't logged properly. It doesn't add up. Elijah exhaled sharply, a flicker of hope igniting in his chest. Then get me a lawyer, he said, keeping his voice low. Or call someone, my assistant, my business partners. Get the truth out. Nathan looked down, jaw clenched. Asterisk, I can't. If they catch me helping you. He shook his head. Henderson, the judge, they'll bury me too. Elijah felt his stomach tighten. Of course, this wasn't just about him. The machine ran on fear. It crushed anyone who tried to resist. Then why are you here? Elijah asked. Nathan hesitated, then slowly reached into his pocket, pulled out a cell phone, and slipped it through the bars. You get one call, he whispered. Make it count. Elijah didn't waste time. His fingers trembled as he punched in the number. Lena Brooks, his chief assistant, picked up on the second ring. Elijah? Where the hell are you? The board is panicking. Lena, listen, he cut in. I've been arrested. Framed. They're trying to pin a stolen truck and drugs on me. I need. Suddenly, a shadow loomed over Nathan. A hand yanked him back violently. Nathan cried out, dropping the phone. Elijah barely had time to react before Brock Henderson stepped into view, his face twisted in a deadly grin. You just can't help yourself, can you? Brock sneered, gripping Nathan by the collar. Nathan struggled, but Brock slammed him against the bars, the impact rattling through the cell. Trying to play hero, rookie? Brock spat. You think this guy gives a damn about you? Elijah lunged to the bars, fists gripping the steel. Let him go. Brock ignored him, instead pulling out his baton and driving it into Nathan's ribs. Nathan gasped, doubling over, his breath coming in sharp, pained gulps. That was stupid, Brock muttered, shaking his head. Now you're just as screwed as him. Then he threw Nathan to the ground like garbage. Elijah felt his blood boil, but he forced himself to stay calm. This wasn't over. Nathan had given him a lifeline, and Elijah intended to use it. Nathan Foster lay on the cold concrete floor, struggling to breathe, his arms wrapped tightly around his bruised ribs. Elijah Carter sat motionless on the cot, fists clenched, his mind racing. Brock Henderson stood over the young officer, sneering, his shadow stretching across the dimly lit cell. That was a bad move, rookie, Brock muttered, nudging Nathan with his boot. You had a future. Now, you're just another dumb kid who thought he could be a hero. Elijah gritted his teeth, the weight of the cuffs digging into his wrists. Nathan had risked everything to help him, and Brock had made him pay for it. The ex-cop bent down, ripping Nathan's badge off his uniform, twirling it between his fingers. "You don't deserve this," he spat. "You think you get to make the rules?" News flash. He leaned in, voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "We make the rules." Nathan winced but held Brock's gaze, refusing to look away. "If that were true," Nathan rasped, "you wouldn't have to lie." Brock's jaw tensed. Then, without warning, he slammed the badge onto the floor, grinding it under his heel. "You're done," Brock snapped. Then, turning back to Elijah, his smirk widened. "And as for you," he let the words hang in the air. "Hope you're ready for your arraignment this morning. Calloway is already waiting. And let me tell you, that man does not like your kind." Elijah felt the rage coil in his chest like a spring wound too tight. But he forced himself to breathe, to think. This wasn't over. Because Nathan's whisper of defiance meant something. Because Lena had heard him. Because, outside this hellhole, a storm was already brewing. Across town, at 5:47 a.m., Lena Brooks was making sure of that. Her hands flew over her keyboard, sending emails, making calls, pulling every string she could. She was relentless, methodical. When Elijah's call had gone through, she had wasted zero time. She had contacted local reporters, civil rights attorneys, and state officials, anyone who had power and a voice. And by the time the sun began creeping over Briarwood County, the first headlines started appearing online. Prominent businessman arrested in suspicious case. Possible police misconduct? Briarwood County under scrutiny as high-profile arrest raises questions. Where is Elijah Carter? His team demands answers. Lena sat back in her chair, watching the articles spread like wildfire across social media. Then her phone rang. "This is Lena. Ms. Brooks, this is Raymond Holden, civil rights attorney. I saw the reports. I want in." Lena grinned. "Good. Because they're about to realize Elijah Carter isn't just another name on their docket." Back in the holding cell, Nathan managed to sit up, his breathing uneven. Elijah shifted closer, voice low. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "You could have walked away." Nathan gave a pained chuckle. "And let them keep getting away with it?" He shook his head. "I've seen too much already. I couldn't ignore it anymore." Elijah studied him, a young man who still had hope in a system that had failed them both. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to turn this tide. "The call went through," Elijah said. "Lena heard me." Nathan's bruised lip twitched into a weak smile. "Good. Maybe she'll burn this whole damn place down." Elijah smirked, but then his expression hardened. Asterisk, "They're framing me, Nathan. They've done it before, and they'll keep doing it. But if Lena can get the right people involved, if we can get proof," he looked Nathan directly in the eye, "we can bring them down." Nathan was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Then let's get you out of here." The plan started with a whisper. Nathan waited until the graveyard shift took over, when only 2 officers remained at the front desk. Despite his injuries, he forced himself to move. He had one shot at this. He shuffled toward the evidence room, his ribs screaming in protest. The security keypad glowed in the dim light. Nathan typed in the code. Click. The door unlocked. Inside, shelves upon shelves of confiscated items loomed before him. And there, right in the middle, was what he needed. Elijah Carter's wallet, his truck registration, his clean record. Then, on another shelf, a bag of cocaine labeled with Elijah's name. Nathan's stomach twisted. Proof. He yanked out his phone, snapping picture after picture. Every document, every falsified report, every piece of manufactured evidence. And then, with a deep breath, he sent the images to Lena. The moment he hit send, his phone buzzed. A single reply from her. "We've got them. Be ready." Nathan exhaled, closing his eyes for a second. The machine had made a mistake. And now, they were going to rip it apart. 6:38 a.m. Judge Richard Calloway was just stepping into his office when his phone rang. He frowned, picking it up. "What?" he barked. The voice on the other end was panicked. "Sir, we have a problem. A big one." Calloway's fingers tightened around the receiver. "Spit it out." There was a long pause. Then, "The media is all over this. And sir, there are photos." For the first time in years, Judge Calloway felt something close to fear. Because in Briarwood County, things were never supposed to get out. But this time they had. The sunlight filtered through the cracked blinds, casting thin slivers of light across Elijah Carter's cell. He sat motionless on the cot, eyes fixed on the wall, his mind racing with thoughts of the coming day. The system, which had worked against him for so long, was now starting to show cracks. He could feel it in the air. Something was changing. He was no longer just Elijah Carter, the businessman, the self-made man from Briarwood County. He was something bigger now, a symbol, a voice for all those who had suffered under the weight of a corrupt system. And he wasn't about to let that go to waste. As the door creaked open, Elijah stood quickly, his body still stiff from the long hours in the cell. He could hear boots pounding the hallway as the morning shift began. His eyes narrowed as he noticed the two officers entering his cell, their expressions unreadable. The taller one, Officer Delaney, looked at him with a mocking smile. Well, Mr. Carter. Big day for you today, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Hope you're ready for your arraignment. Judge Calloway's waiting. Elijah's gaze remained steady, his face a mask of calm determination. He had seen the pomp and circumstance of these trials before. This was nothing new. What mattered was that the storm was finally here, and he was going to face it head-on. They led him down the narrow hall, his footsteps echoing, a reminder of the steep climb ahead. As they passed through the station's corridors, Elijah's eyes caught glimpses of the bureaucratic walls, those cold, gray hallways that hid all the corruption, all the broken pieces of the system he was about to expose. The small courtroom buzzed with voices when Elijah was escorted inside. He could feel eyes on him, a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and, most of all, contempt. The clerk called the case, and Judge Richard Calloway, a man with a reputation as a staunch enforcer of the law, took his seat behind the gavel. His cold, calculating eyes met Elijah's for a brief moment before looking away. The charges were read, and each word was like a dagger in his chest: grand theft auto, resisting arrest, obstruction of justice, and, of course, the drug possession that had been planted on him. Elijah listened intently, his jaw clenched, but he didn't flinch. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about everyone who had been falsely accused, whose voices had been silenced. Your Honor, Elijah began, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the courtroom's tension. The charges against me are false. The evidence is fabricated. The courtroom fell silent. Calloway's eyes flicked to the prosecutor, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. Oh, really? Calloway muttered, his voice low and dismissive. And what proof do you have, Mr. Carter? Hearsay and conjecture. Elijah took a breath, pushing aside his growing frustration. The proof is in the system, Your Honor. Check the records, check the evidence logs. You'll see it's all been manipulated. But if you look carefully enough, the truth will be clear. There was a moment of unsettling silence. Elijah felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly buried beneath the weight of the room. Calloway leaned back in his chair, his face cold and unreadable. Then, the door swung open, and a new figure entered the courtroom, cutting through the tension like a blade. It was Raymond Holden, the civil rights attorney Lena had contacted. Elijah didn't even need to look at the man to know that he had brought the storm with him. Holden was flanked by a small group of reporters, cameras flashing as they entered the courtroom, drawing the attention of everyone present. Holden stepped forward, his voice steady as he addressed the court. Your Honor, I have a statement regarding this case. The evidence against Mr. Carter has been called into question by numerous sources, and the public demands transparency. A murmur rippled through the room. Holden's presence was enough to shift the dynamic. Calloway's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Elijah felt a surge of adrenaline. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a fight for justice, a fight that would be waged in the public eye. He looked toward the reporters, their cameras trained on him, their microphones poised. The moment was here. The storm was finally about to break, and Elijah was ready. As Judge Calloway slammed his gavel, Elijah stood tall. He was ready to face whatever came next. This was no longer just about survival. It was about exposure, about turning the tables on those who had manipulated the system for so long. This was the beginning of the reckoning. The courtroom was alive with a buzz of activity. The air felt thick, charged with tension as reporters scrambled to write down the unfolding drama. Elijah Carter stood at the center, his back straight, his gaze unwavering as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. The shifting dynamics in the room were undeniable. Raymond Holden had thrown down the gauntlet, demanding that the case be re-examined. The reporters had flooded the space with questions, their cameras flashing like lightning. For the first time since his arrest, Elijah felt a sense of possibility. Maybe this wasn't the fight he had anticipated, but it was a fight nonetheless. Judge Calloway's face was a stone mask, but Elijah noticed the slight twitch in his jaw, the faintest sign that the pressure was beginning to mount. Calloway had always been one to bend to power, to the system, and now the spotlight was squarely on him. He had no choice but to play his part. "Mr. Holden," the judge's voice cut through the tension, cold and formal. "While I respect your statement, let's not forget that this is a courtroom, not a media circus." Holden was unfazed. He stepped forward, his voice firm and measured. "Respectfully, Your Honor," he said, eyes locked onto the judge's. "This is no longer just about this courtroom. It's about the integrity of the entire legal system. Mr. Carter's arrest and the charges levied against him have already caused a ripple effect that extends far beyond these walls." The reporters, leaning forward in their seats, captured every word, every movement. Elijah could feel the weight of their attention. It was as if the entire room was collectively holding its breath, waiting for the next move. For the first time in days, Elijah could see a glimmer of hope. Judge Calloway's eyes narrowed, but his silence gave nothing away. He glanced over at the prosecutor, who had been sitting quietly until now. The prosecutor, a man with a sharp jawline and slicked-back hair, stood up slowly, adjusting his tie as though it was all just another routine. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, his voice dripping with the same arrogance that had plagued the case from the beginning. "While I understand the public outcry, the evidence is clear. We have video footage, eyewitness accounts, and documentation that support the charges against Mr. Carter. His history, his conduct, it all points to one thing: he's guilty." Elijah flinched, but only slightly. He had expected this. He had known it would be a hard road, but he wasn't going to let this accusation define him. Holden didn't flinch. He stood his ground, eyes never leaving the prosecutor. "We are aware of the supposed evidence, but we also know it has been tampered with," Holden said calmly. "The drug charges are fabricated. The arrest itself is questionable at best. The evidence doesn't add up. Your Honor, this isn't just about Mr. Carter's freedom. This is about accountability. This is about holding those responsible for manipulating the system." A murmur rippled through the room. Even the judge's hand wavered slightly, his fingers tapping lightly against the gavel. He was losing control, and for the first time, it wasn't because of Elijah. The reporters were on edge, their cameras flashing again. Elijah could see the headlines forming in their minds as they wrote and typed. He could feel the shift in the room. The wheels of justice were turning, but this time, they were turning in his favor. But it wasn't enough yet. Elijah knew that this was only the beginning. He needed more than just the attention of the press. He needed to expose the corruption that had put him in this situation. He needed the truth to be undeniable. The judge, however, was still trying to maintain his authority, still clinging to the illusion of control. "Enough of this," Calloway said, slamming his gavel down. "We will proceed with the arraignment. Mr. Carter, you will be charged as per the prosecution's request. However, I will allow additional investigations into the claims of evidence tampering." Elijah's heart sank for a moment, but Holden wasn't done. He stepped forward once more, his voice booming in the quiet room. "Your Honor, we request that all charges be dropped pending a full investigation into the conduct of the arresting officers and the handling of evidence. This is not just a case about one man's freedom. It's about the integrity of this entire system." Elijah's pulse raced. He felt the tide shift completely now. It wasn't just about his fate anymore. It was about all those who had been wronged, the people who were so often overlooked, silenced, and dismissed. The judge's expression flickered. For the briefest of moments, he was no longer the authority in control. He was simply a man faced with a choice. This was his test. As Elijah met the judge's eyes, he felt the weight of the moment. This was his chance to prove that even in a broken system, the truth could prevail.